is Jackie Clement, CEO and Executive Director of the Fair Media Council, welcoming you to this month's workshop, which will be tips for becoming an effective spokesperson. And it will be featuring Terry Lynam of Northwell Health, who really doesn't need any introduction. You all know him well. Very excited to have Terry with us today. He's opted to answer questions and do more of a conversation style presentation as opposed to a singular presentation. So I would like to remind you to use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen to pose any questions. And you can start doing that immediately. I will fill the questions and we will put Terry to work as much as possible, put it that way. Just a few things before we begin. I do want to point out that this will be the last workshop of this type for the summer. So we're taking off July and August, and we will be back in September with a workshop featuring a media attorney talking about common mistakes people make with their websites that often result in lawsuits. So I would encourage you to, one, whoever it is on staff that works on your website, have them sign up for this particular workshop, but also spend the summer if you're making any changes to your website or thinking about making changes. Bring those questions to us in September, and you can maybe get some clarity or better direction on what you should be doing. So that is the update on these particular workshops. The other update I have for you is, you know, every summer we do a boot camp, which is typically a half-day morning event. What we're doing with it this year, we are going to stay virtual for a couple of reasons. One, we know not everyone is fully comfortable with going to events just yet. Two, the virtual format is really working well for us in terms of workshops and learning more of a classroom style setting. So that is working out pretty well with our members in particular. But also we're making a big push to bring you some great speakers from all over the place. So we will begin July 21st, and it will actually be a series of speakers, and it will happen across multiple dates and probably a 6 to 8 week format. The kind of thing you could buy a ticket for one particular session, or you can buy one all access pass for all of the sessions. And we're bringing you speakers from across the country and one or two from Europe to talk about everything from building trust to a digital first mentality, to how technology impacts perception and how that impacts your tendency to buy from a brand. So it will be a very wide-ranging set of speakers, and one, I hope you will enjoy it, but two, it will also give you the opportunity to ask your questions. So now with that, we want to bring on Terry and actually begin today's workshop. So I am going to, Terry, can you come back?
I am here.
There you are. Okay. So I'm just going to stop the screen share at this point. And we're just going to kick off. I'm going to start at what I think is probably the most basic question, but often misunderstood, which is the skill set that is needed to be a successful spokesperson. You know, we find a lot of people that are running organizations where you have a spokesperson that's not dedicated to media relations. Often it's a split job, but basically if they clean up nice, they look good, they can be our spokesperson. Terry, talk to me about, if you were to hire someone, what kind of skills would you be looking for? What kind of experience, and who would you trust to really, you know, be able to be out there in the public eye with your brand?
Yeah, so obviously good written verbal communication skills are a must, and that's kind of a given in our field. But you know, some of the other things, such as just confidence, somebody who is not going to be easily rattled under stressful situations, somebody who shows good judgment, somebody who can communicate very well up, down, and sideways in the organization. And that's something, you know, what I'm saying is someone who's going to be, is not going to talk down to people who are below them, somebody who can manage up and is going to communicate very well with your senior leadership, and obviously communicating well with your peers, whether it be folks in marketing or whatever the case might be. So I think, that helps gain respect, gain your respect from people throughout the organization, and it'll go a long way to really ensure people gain credibility, respect within the organization. And I think the other important thing too is somebody who's a quick learner, somebody who can immerse themselves within the company and really doesn't require a lot of hand-holding in the process. So I think those are the main skills. Now the problem is when you're bringing somebody in, you don't necessarily know if they have those skills, but you could presumably find that out in discussions with their references, former co-workers, et cetera.
Okay, so that's inside the organization. What about with the news media themselves? What kind of experience do you look for there?
In terms of hiring people from the news media?
In terms of hiring a spokesperson, so what kind of experience working with the news media do you look for?
Yeah, so my own background is I was a reporter for 9 years before I got into PR, and so I do have a bias in favor of folks that come from the journalism side. I think they tend to be better writers. I've found that, particularly on the print side, and obviously the communication skills. They're dealing with news stories on a daily basis, and they have to be very inquisitive. They're dealing with people at all levels of government, all levels throughout the community. So that I think helps ensure that most reporters and editors that I know tend to be all have great communication skills. It's just par for the course.
Okay. Can you give me a little bit with your background? Was it a ladder that you actually went up to become chief spokesperson, or how does that happen?
Yeah, so it was a transition. So as I mentioned, I was a reporter for about 9 years in newspapers in upstate New York. I got the opportunity to get into PR in the late 1980s. I got a job in the press office of former Governor Mario Cuomo. And so I was there for about 7 years. And that was one of the things that, in terms of really preparing me to be a good spokesperson, is the ability to be quick on your feet. In that job, this is late 80s. Mario Cuomo happened to be viewed as a potential presidential candidate at that point. So we were getting barraged with media calls every single day. So yeah, you had to be very articulate. You had to be in terms of advocating for policies. They would send the press officers out. They would have us cold call editorial writers across the state, everywhere from the Buffalo News to the Watertown Daily Times, and trying to pitch what our legislative priorities were. So that required you had to be a real quick read on those types of issues, policy issues. So I think that was really something that prepared me for my future jobs, is really getting thrown into the fire there. From there, I was there when Mario Cuomo lost the election to George Pataki, and so I was out of work for a few months, and I ended up making the transition to a company known as Lockheed Martin. It was a non-defense division within Lockheed Martin that did a lot of work with state, local governments, authorities, et cetera, on things like easy pass toll collection, child support collections, all the back office processing stuff. So from there, I transitioned to Northwell in 2001, and was there for about 19 years up until last summer, when transitioned out, moved into a part-time consulting role, which I've been in since then.
Okay, we do have a question already, but before I get to that, I just want you to give a little bit of an idea to people of what your typical daily schedule was like, because obviously it doesn't sound 9 to 5. as well as how many people were reporting to you at Northwell?
So we had a public relations falls within the marketing and communications department within Northwell. Within PR specifically, we have about 16, 17 folks on the PR team. My typical day would start around 8 o'clock, 7:30, 8 o'clock, and a lot of, like, not surprisingly, a lot of meetings in the course of the day, but it was trying to keep up with steady stream of phone calls, both from the news media as well as from folks internally who are looking for PR support for one initiative or another. And it was typically a 12-hour day, very standard day, and most, not surprisingly, most of the work was that you're able to get done happens early and then late, because in between there's all kind of chaos typically. So and I had the added burden of a long commute. So yeah, my day started at about 4:15, and I walked in the door about 9 o'clock at night. So I did that for about, as I said, 19 years. So I had to get off that train.
Okay, so let's start with a question, actually from Rich Toranzano, who I know you know well.
Yeah,
He's asking, what is the most difficult and personally challenging issue you had to deal with as a spokesperson, either in business or politics?
so I got to tell you, the most trying time for me was the last few months of my my tenure at Northwell, dealing with the COVID pandemic. That was really an overwhelming experience from the time that the virus struck, and we started seeing our first cases in early March. Obviously still going on right now, but those first few months when hospitalizations were spiking, almost all hospitals across the New York area were at or over capacity. Intensive care unit beds had filled up and the hospital officials actually had to identify new locations for ICU beds. So again, the volume of calls from the media was just astounding. During that stage, we did some proactive media. We were trying to highlight a particular patient story, a patient success story, such as somebody who had been on a ventilator for 2 months and was finally discharged. But a lot of it was just incoming calls from national media, local, regional reporters, and we had a very steady stream of. We were very fortunate because our CEO Michael Dowling was working very closely with Governor Andrew Cuomo at the time in terms of establishing a battle plan for how the state responded. So he was a close advisor to him on those topics. So fortunately, Michael had a very prominent role in news media. He was featured on 60 Minutes. He was featured on Face the Nation. So again, that happened to be a very stressful time. And during, again, my typical day before all that was 12 hours a day. It really kind of transitioned into I would work until 10, 11 o'clock at night. So it was like a 14, 15-hour day every day from March up until at least like May, June timeframe.
Okay, I'm curious, now that we're past kind of the hump of the pandemic, and you can look back on the news coverage of the past year or 18 months, how much of your time was actually devoted to correcting misinformation in the news?
Something, I think we had a very good relationship with the news media, and what I found is I tried to be forthcoming as possible with reporters about what was going on. I did find that many hospitals and health systems were not as open with reporters in talking about what was going on. A good example, I remember the New York Post was doing a story about the number of deaths that were occurring in hospitals. And because of our size, as I mentioned, hospitals were stretched to over capacity. At our high water mark was early April. We had every day early April, we were around 3,500 COVID patients in our hospitals. And again, given the fatality rate with the virus, particularly during those early days, we were seeing close to about 75 people a day who were dying. And so again, the Post was basically looking for numbers. And we made a conscious decision to disclose that number. What I found out afterwards was that most of my colleagues in the industry did not want to share that number, that kind of information. So I think that kind of transparency with the media really helped, and it established a level of trust, credibility, and relationships that exist to this day. So we developed a lot of good contacts with producers at national news organizations, as well as print pubs. So again, I think the news media handled the situation pretty admirably.
Okay, all right. Now, can you compare the experience of COVID versus you did a huge project with the rebranding of Northwell?
Yeah, so that was mostly proactive outreach, and that's a good point. I mean, when you change the name of your organization, the whole process of trying to keep your local constituency informed and get the word out about why you changed the name, and trying to highlight the reasons behind it. That was also again probably a 1 or 2 year campaign of steady outreach, but yeah, it was not at the same. It was not at the same level as COVID in terms of the demands, but it was challenging. A big part of that was also internally trying to engage our own employees and get their support for the name change, because many of them, like many hospitals, we had employees who are typically been with the organization for 20, 30, even 40 plus years. So, trying to explain what the rationale is for a name change, trying to get them on board with it. So there was a whole campaign leading up to the official launch that was really focused on trying to engage employees and get them on board with the messaging.
Okay, and just remind people, how many employees are we talking about?
We're talking about 76,000 employees. So we're the largest employer in New York State, as well as the largest health system.
Okay, all right. So I do have a question here from Cindy Martenfeld, who I believe you also know, asking, what's your most memorable PR campaign at Northwell, both the positive and the negative?
Well, I think I'm going to give that some thought a little bit here. I think the rebranding campaign, what we did with the rebranding campaign is we tried to highlight stories where particularly patient stories where Northwell distinguished itself, and we used that as an opportunity to highlight the new name and highlight the vision, the mission of the organization. And I remember there was a campaign that was very much focused on veterans, and we have a big focus on veterans within Northwell. We hire about 500 veterans every year across the organization, and we had one initiative in particular where we had working with our Center for 3D Printing, we actually produced a prosthetic leg that allowed veterans to swim with what was in essence it was called the fin. So they were now these are veterans, many of whom were like triathletes before they went to war, who were now able to whether it be go in the ocean with their kids, go in a pool, something that they had been unable to do prior to that because of the fact that, again, with a typical prosthetic limb, they could take it off, but it's, you know, trying to navigate on the beach or on the pool side was very difficult. So most of them did not even bother. So anyway, my point is that we try to highlight those types of stories as a way to get the new name out there and to promote it in a positive way. So yeah, that was one that we ended up getting some really. There was one story in particular we were successful in getting on the cover of the New York Times Science section about that particular 3D printing initiative. So that was very successful.
Yeah, and it sounds like a really cool initiative too. How about the flip side of that? What's a campaign that you thought would go in one direction but really did not work out? Anything come to mind on that?
So yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges for PR folks, and I don't mean this as to be negative towards our marketing colleagues, but many times when we launch a marketing campaign, there's pressure there to highlight, to get some news media coverage for not about the campaign itself, but for something that ties back to the campaign. A good example, if you're doing an advertising blitz around cardiac care, cancer care, orthopedics, there's often pressure on PR folks to try to highlight some of our expertise along those same lines. So, and I don't identify it necessarily as a failure, but a big challenge in trying to piggyback on the marketing campaign by highlighting patient success stories, identifying like a cancer patient who was able to overcome pancreatic cancer because of the expertise of our physicians, or again, a compelling cardiac patient. So, but that's the way we're able to respond to those situations. But sometimes it's difficult, you know, highlighting an orthopedic story. You know, it's one of those. I go back to the example. Well, my knee used to hurt. That I got treated for it. Now it doesn't hurt anymore. You know, sometimes those stories are not necessarily going to be generating the news coverage that that the marketing people want.
Right. Okay. We do have a couple instances. Let me go back to a screen share to show a couple of stories where they were rather controversial, where you as the spokesperson, you have to handle that. And let me just pull up. Oh, let's get rid of that. Hang on, bear with me here. Okay, here's one. Now, if you land in Newsday, that's normally a good thing, except when you land in the Long Island crime section of Newsday, which is where you happen to be in this particular case. So for this headline, hospital official denies sexual assault allegation. Can you give a little background on what this story was, just to remind people? And
yeah, so I think at most, I should say most, many organizations and many spokespeople throughout their tenure in any organization, they're going to run into situations where whether it be a senior leader or other high-level employee within the organization gets in trouble for one thing or another. It could be sexual misconduct. It could be a drunk driving. It could be for some kind of fiscal mismanagement. So being able to, and these things, in this particular case, this involved a gentleman who used to be the head of Long Island Jewish Medical Center, which is one of our flagship hospitals. So it turned out that he had a crack addiction, and unbeknownst to us. And so in this particular story, we were totally blindsided because he was called to testify in a criminal court case involving a woman who was accused of drunk driving. Now, the woman said she was driving drunk because the backstory here, and the story doesn't get into it, but they, the guy who used to be the head of our hospital had met this woman in a bar, and they drove somewhere, I think into Huntington, to buy crack, and then
Okay.
they pulled over to the side of the road somewhere, I think in Woodbury or Westbury, and were smoking crack. And the woman who was with him claimed that she had some concerns that he was going to sexually assault her. So she jumped in the car, drove away, left him there, and then down the road she got pulled over and charged with drunk driving.
Okay.
So this hospital official got called in to testify. To basically, he had to testify on behalf of the prosecution. And what this, I mean, again, we had no knowledge that this was going to be happening, that he was going to be going before the court. And we ended up being totally blindsided by the whole situation. So, you know, these types of stories, again, in any, this obviously falls under the category of a crisis management situation. So what do you do in those situations? You're trying to, your number one goal obviously is to try to protect the reputation of the organization. So it involves these rapidly called meetings with your Office of Legal Affairs, with risk management, other senior leadership to try to assess what to do, what to say. So again, whether it's a case like this or whether it's a case more that we've all seen on sexual misconduct charges or allegations, there's a lot of that going around, and you know, PR professionals generally, I think, just have to be prepared to have a process in place for dealing with this as quickly as possible when these issues arise.
All right. Let me take you to a different type of story, but also not a favorable headline. This one from the New York Post. This guy makes $10 million a year to head a nonprofit organization.
Yeah. So
now, did you have any idea this story was going to break?
Yeah. So every year, both the New York Post and Crane's New York Business Magazine, we other organizations have to file what are called 990 forms, which disclose the salaries of your highest paid employees. So we know early on, okay, whose salaries are kind of eye popping that could potentially generate news coverage. And in this particular year, our as I remember, Michael Dowling had turned 65, which as a result of that, he earned a supplemental employee retirement bonus, which again, I think it was like $7 or $8 million, that alone, on top of his typical compensation, which I think it was like at time like $1.5 million. So this is trying to whenever you're talking about your boss's salary, it always, again, it creates a lot of angst. And it's really important to have a whole set of talking points prepared that explains some of the underlying circumstances here. So what do you do in a situation like this? Well, you point out the fact that the man is running a 23 hospital health system, the largest in New York State. You compare his salary to those earned by other CEOs who are running a 1 or 2 or 3 hospital health system. You talk about all the other factors that come into play, how your boss's salary compares to others, other areas of the country. What are some of the other factors that require health systems and hospitals to compensate at this level? How do we arrive at this number? You talk about the work that we do with some of our consultants to identify what is a fair salary. What's the process for approving it? There's a special committee that our board of trustees has that reviews the salaries of senior leadership. So Again, when you're dealing with when you're talking to the media about your boss's salary, you have to have your talking points down pat, because you do not want to misstep and be misquoted or venture into an area that you feel uncomfortable talking about.
Okay, I do want to ask you what happens when a misquote does occur. But before that, I want to get to a question regarding working with the boss. And this is actually another question from the audience, which is, how much of a trust must there be between you and your boss, whether it be Michael Dowling or a previous boss? As Michael's pretty media savvy. So I imagine, and tell me if I'm wrong, I imagine he would say, Terry, this is your area of expertise. I will rely on your judgment, versus a CEO who says, oh, ignore it, it's not going to be a big deal. So tell me how that dynamic works.
Yeah, so I think the number one thing is you need to have regular communications with your CEO or your boss. And the one thing that CEOs do not want are any surprises. So if there's any issues that are percolating out there that could potentially reflect poorly on the organization, they need to know about it early on. So Michael Dowling happens to be someone who has a pretty good media sense, as you said. He knows what stories are going to generate coverage. So when we're trying to do a news conference about the opening of a new building, he knows that that's not necessarily going to generate a lot of media. And he also knows that the stories that are going to generate media are typically going to involve patient success stories. So he's very realistic in that sense. But there's also, like most CEOs, he's demanding, and he wants recognition for certain programs that or initiatives that he thinks reflect positively on the organization. So back to the original question, yeah, there has to be we would talk to him at least a couple of times a week, if not more often, just to update him all the time on what's going on the media side, on the marketing side. I suspect, and this I think is the case, because I found this with other organizations, even in state government with the governor. The governor has a closer relationship typically with his press office than he does with many of his other senior advisors, because again, he recognizes the impact that a bad story or even a good story, what impact that's going to have with his constituents.
Okay. All right. So let's move into the area of, let's say you did a media interview and you later see the interview and you're like, that's not what I said at all, or that's not what the story is supposed to be about. Either the premise is completely off base, or whatever you said had been edited and basically misleads whoever is watching or viewing the piece into believing the opposite of what actually happened. How do you handle those sorts of situations?
Well, it's not really as much of being misquoted as the story really having a premise that is inaccurate. And one of the examples that I think is a good one, and if you were going to ask this question separately, I'll apologize. But hospital billing is one topic that often generates a lot of awful stories for healthcare organizations. Hospital bills are some of the most arcane process that you'd ever want. Totally different than any other industry. You don't just come in and, okay, I'm getting a knee replacement. That's going to cost X amount of money. There's so many there's so many other factors that determine what your final bill is going to be.
Okay.
Because typically what happens is hospitals have negotiated rates that they have with Medicare and Medicaid, as well as commercial insurance like United Healthcare, Aetna. What confuses consumers is that they'll receive from their insurance companies something called like an explanation of benefits. And what that'll show is what they'll show these charges that nobody ever pays, that individuals don't pay, that insurance companies don't pay, because I said the insurance companies will pay whatever the negotiated rate is. But
Right.
these numbers, like totally eye-popping numbers that infuriate patients, because, well, why are they charging that kind of money? So often those stories, reporters, even some of the good ones, even some reporters with the New York Times, they'll find these patients out there, many of whom, by the way, it becomes a story, and they'll end up getting these bills, or they'll end up getting sued for payment, for non-payment, because of the fact that they've ignored all the bills that are being sent to them. And that happens a lot. And not only does it happen if they don't pay the bill, there'll be judgments filed against them. So it really creates a terrible situation for the individual, and embarrassing for the hospitals. So trying to explain away how a hospital bill that could be tens of thousands of dollars, trying to explain that to news media it's a very much a battle in trying to get them to frame the story in an accurate way. And 9 times out of 10, the reporters are going to be very sympathetic to the patient who got the bill, even if the patient ignored bills for the last year. You're always put in a very defensive situation, and it portrays hospitals in a very negative way. And we get portrayed as like money grubbers, which is furthest from the truth. But again, that is something that we're continually, and I say we, I think hospitals generally continue to fight against, trying to educate consumers that they do need to call the finance office of the hospitals to try to work out a payment arrangement with these bills. And then the big battle, trying to explain all this to reporters. Insurance companies generally have very high-powered communications professionals who I think have, I don't want to say infiltrate is the wrong word, but they've developed really strong relationships with many news organizations and they have convinced them, they have tried to portray hospitals as being, even though hospital profit margins are nowhere near as large as what insurance companies make, hospitals have been portrayed as being the bad guys in this whole disagreement and fight. So that's one of the things that we battle against all the time.
Okay. Do you find any part of this issue is reflective in how the news media kind of fell out of having beat reporters and people that specialize in hospital and health?
Yeah,
and you find yourself having to explain a lot to a general assignment reporter who, yesterday covered a football game and today is supposed to cover an explanation of benefit story.
Yeah, some of that. I think that's partially true. I think some of I think most major news outlets do have reporters who specialize on these topics, but even dealing with them, again, I think there's a bias against hospitals. And again, because of the arcane because of the arcane nature of the hospital billing process, trying to explain it to reporters, consumers, very, very difficult. So, but part of it does tie back. You'll get general assignment. To your point, you get general assignment reporters who will be calling you about a topic that they're totally unfamiliar with, and you really have to start from scratch in terms of trying to explain how the process works. So yeah, the lack of specialty is certainly become more of an issue as as news organizations shrink.
Okay. Let's talk about what's probably the worst part of the spectrum here, which is not insurance companies themselves, but actually lawyers. When the lawyers step in to tell the communicators you can't say something, there's a constant tug of war basically going on between what an attorney will say is in the best interest of an organization versus what you may be saying is not in the best interest of the perception of the brand. So how do you handle those situations?
Yeah, and that is a real tug of war, I have to tell you. And we deal with that very often. Anytime, particularly when there's a high profile case. We had I'll give you a good example. This is probably 15 years ago, maybe even longer, and we had cases involving patients who became infected with hepatitis C from one of our cardiac surgeons who, unbeknownst to him, he was a carrier of hepatitis C. And cardiac surgery can be where the surgeons are physically breaking open the chest cavity, even though they have gloves on. The bones within the chest cavity often puncture the gloves. And in this case, our surgeon inadvertently exposed about 10 or 11 patients to hepatitis C. And this became known probably a year or two later, and as a result of some detective work by our own infectious disease folks, tied all these cases back to the fact that all the patients had heart surgery. So we ended up doing some testing on the surgeon and identified that, yes, indeed, he was positive for hepatitis C. It was a very defensible situation from a PR standpoint. And again, the doctor, very well loved by his patients, well respected throughout within the cardiac community, was devastated by the fact that all this was happening. We, on the PR side, had a whole different tact about how we wanted to approach the story. We wanted to get that doctor out there and talk to the media about and personally about about his own practices and the fact that he was not aware that he was a carrier of hepatitis C. Our lawyers wanted nothing of it because they knew that anything he said at the time would come back to impact litigation down the road. And so we were very limited. We were never able to put that doctor out there to talk to the media. All the conversations with news organizations went through me. And that was a story that Newsday was covering, like one story a week that went on for months. It was a horrible ongoing crisis for us. Again, damaged the reputation of the surgeon, really did not reflect well on the hospital. So there's always that push and pull with lawyers who want to say as little as possible. And it happens not only with cases like this, but even any kind of cases involving claims that a patient was the victim of a medical error. Those obviously pop up on occasion too. So that again, the tug of war with our lawyers is always ongoing. So what you're trying to do is come to some kind of push as hard as you can on the PR side, recognizing the desire to, again, do or say whatever you can to protect the reputation of the organization. But in the end, what you end up saying is nowhere near what you want to say because of the limitations imposed by the lawyers.
Okay. Are there any times, though, where you just say to the lawyers, this needs to be said, and we just need to get better lawyers to defend us in the long run?
Well, and when you're really at loggerheads, that's when you go to the CEO and you lay it on the line and say, listen, we're going to get killed here in this story unless we can be more aggressive in our response. And that would be helpful sometimes. The lawyer in turn will call the CEO and try to make the argument to the contrary. But when there's really a heavy duty conflict between PR and legal, that's typically what we would do is just escalate it and try to get the CEO to weigh in our favor.
Okay, got it. How about, kind of staying on this same topic, what happens when you're doing a news interview and they ask a question that you really don't want to answer? So how do you handle that situation?
Yeah, so what I would do, and most of the time, ahead of time what there are thorny issues out there. There's some controversy brewing that you have to be very, very careful about how you respond. And so what I would do is I would have a set of talking points that would try to basically position us or include messaging that we're comfortable having out there. Oftentimes reporters, they would be more direct in their question. They would want us to disclose information that we don't want to put out there. And it's a real merry-go-round, but a lot of times you're going to put out your talking points and or statement. Reporters are going to push back. I would just go round and around and try to just again reinforce the message that we want out there without specifically answering the questions that the reporters want answers to. And again, it creates a lot of frustration on both sides, but it's kind of like the nature of the business. Reporters are many times going to want more information than a spokesperson is going to want to disclose, and you have to do what's right for the organization. And if it pisses off the reporter, well, that's unfortunate, but again, that's part of the business.
Okay, I want to kind of segue into some best advice because we're winding down. We've got a few minutes left. I'm kind of wondering, because you are the chief spokesperson, but when you have so many people that you have, whether it's other doctors or say a patient that you want to put in front of the news media, you must do some kind of coaching with them, right?
A little, yeah. So a good example of that would be with our patients. Many times, what we found over the years is patients who have had a positive experience, whether it be through surgery or other treatment. They're very eager. They're very willing to tell their stories. Not always. Sometimes people have a sense of privacy. They don't want to put themselves out there. But many of them, I think it's kind of therapeutic from their own standpoint in talking through the experience that they just lived through, and they're very willing to talk about it. What we would typically do is again, we would suggest that if it is a news conference, for instance, perhaps draft some talking points about what you want to say. That way, you can be a little bit more concise in how you frame the whole experience that you had. We in turn would talk to them and say, well, what do you think? How are you going to handle it? What are you going to say? And if there's stuff in there that we think if they drafted a 15-minute speech, then we say, well, you might want to knock that down to about 5 minutes. So. But you do it in a tactful way, and most people totally understand that situation. Messaging with our, another good example of how you want to prepare your spokespeople, your physicians, for instance, during COVID, a great example. There was an ongoing, everyday ongoing requests from news organizations to talk to infectious disease specialists, to talk to intensive care physicians, emergency room physicians. We had a probably about a dozen or so, maybe even more, spokespeople that we would turn to do these interviews. Ideally, you do some kind of media training with them, whether it's formal media training or whether it's just discussions with the PR team and talking through messaging. The one thing we would do as well is that we would update our messaging on whatever was happening with COVID on a daily basis to give the physicians a better sense about what we as an organization were doing. What were some of the initiatives that we had in place to try to respond to the surge in patients, just to give them a little background about what Northwell was doing in response to this whole pandemic. But most of their questions that were being directed at them were essentially, what are you seeing? What are some of the symptoms you're seeing in these COVID patients? How are you treating them? So the questions were for the physicians very clinically focused, but it's also very helpful for the physicians or whoever to have background about, again, what is the organization doing in response to this crisis.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, are there any reporters or news outlets that you won't deal with?
We kind of have a standing. Very rarely will we simply refuse to talk to a news organization or a particular reporter. Sometimes with specific reporters, you want to avoid them, but I've found over the years you never win by just ignoring a reporter or just refusing to respond to them. I think that minimizes the impact of a negative story. If you know somebody's going to be writing a negative story anyway, you want to frame a message in a way that you think is going to at least blunt the blow that you're going to receive, right? But if you totally ignore a reporter or a news organization, they're going to hit you twice as hard. So I've never been a believer in doing that. But yeah, no, I can't recall any that we simply refuse to deal with. There's many reporters who'll call up and you're like, oh my God, you dread it. You dread the conversation that's coming. But yeah, you do. We would always respond to them.
Okay. I'm curious because you are in the communications part of the organization, but it sounds like you have to have a really strong handle on both the business side and the clinical side.
Yeah. I would say, particularly with larger organizations, your head of corporate communications probably knows the organization better than anybody, even in some cases the CEO. Because you're dealing with physicians across the organization. You're dealing with hospital leaders. Again, we have 23 hospitals, so you know what's going on everywhere, and because you're getting pulled into it on a daily basis. You know the innovative initiatives that you're pursuing, new programs, new services. So my point is, you do most spokespeople. If you're a good spokesperson, you have to immerse yourself in the organization, as I mentioned before, and really know it inside and out. And that is something that I think is a requirement. That whenever you join an organization, you have to. The first thing you do is spend the first couple of weeks getting to know what the business side. How do hospitals make money? What are some of the pitfalls? Again, hospital billing. You need to know where your liabilities are. Where are some of the vulnerabilities, I meant to say? What are some of the issues that could potentially come back to bite you down the road? So yeah, that knowing the business in general is a prerequisite.
Okay, and I think that pretty much plays out no matter what the industry is, right? If you're going to be the spokesperson.
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, and you're as the spokesperson, you're typically in any kind of crisis situation too. The PR person is going to be the one that's out there, at least initially. There are some people that do it very well. I think, I've found that Southwest Airlines has a very good communications team. They had this incident, it was like 2018, where they had the country's first in-flight fatality. They had there was a flight out of LaGuardia where the engine exploded, and it ripped open the fuselage and it killed one of the passengers. And they ended up doing an emergency landing in Philadelphia. Total heroics on the part of the pilot, the crew. At the same time, you had passengers who were videotaping everything. This horrible scene that was unfolding. Southwest, the outreach that was done was incredible from a PR standpoint. There was the individual communications, phone calls to every single passenger. Do you need trauma counseling? Obviously taking care of any kind of travel and housing, temporary housing accommodations. Pay a $5,000 check, no strings attached, to do whatever. On top of that, $1,000 travel voucher for future travel. So again, the open communication with passengers, with family during that time, they do it very well. And I think that they're a good example. But yet you have people you have organizations like Tesla that have totally they've done away with their PR department. They don't have a PR department. Elon Musk has 40 million Twitter followers. So in his view, he doesn't need the news organization to position his company or try to frame whatever his company is doing. He's the mouthpiece for the organization. So they've done away with their PR department, which I think is remarkable.
And it's interesting because he's not actually a very effective spokesperson most of the time.
Very combative, yeah, sure.
But that does dovetail into, I guess, what should be our final talking point today, which is how does social media influence what you're doing in terms of being a spokesperson, but also issues you talk about in the news media, where now people can kind of add their own comments or retweet with their own perspective on something which may not be favorable.
Yeah, and that's something that our social media team keeps very close tabs on. So if somebody's having a bad experience, if you have a patient in a hospital bed who's posting these tweets or posting stuff on Facebook about what a horrible experience they're having, you kind of try to intervene immediately by reaching out, trying to take it offline and address the matter one-on-one. And that's like the first order of business there. And then do you if the conversation continues and there's ongoing dialogue, that kind of mushrooms into a whole crisis situation. I remember when Beyonce gave birth at Lenox Hill Hospital, and what happened at the time is Beyonce and Jay-Z's security team were kind of flexing their muscles within the hospital and preventing patients, visitors from going down certain hallways. And it really created a bad situation and a lot of a social media storm developing as a result of all that. And so that's an example where you have to be a lot more aggressive in trying to correct that situation and explain and try to explain and do some constructive follow-up afterwards to try to put out that fire. But yeah, that certainly most of our social media really is kind of very much focused, particularly with Facebook, and trying to really just kind of promote health and wellness. That's our typical approach. But yeah, on the crisis side, there's always obviously we're in tune to what's happening on a daily basis.
Okay. we need to wrap up. So my final question will be, is there anything we didn't touch on that you think we should at least address? Or maybe if you have a couple tips or advice for people that are thinking about, they want to be a spokesperson, because obviously you have some great days and then you have some not so great days when you're the person who's the face of an organization.
Yeah, it's you got to view it as a marathon. Because it's a demanding job. Um, Again, the larger the organization, the more demanding it becomes. I think making sure that you as a communicator have a seat at the table, meaning that you're a key member of the leadership team, need to know what's happening, don't want to find out about stuff that happened that came out of a leadership meeting that nobody bothered to tell you about. And that requires kind of flexing your muscle from time to time and making sure that, again, you have a seat at the table and you're able to provide input on vital communications matters. And in some organizations, they don't. It's like the PR marketing people. They get pushed aside. So I think for any progressive organization, it's key that you have a solid marketing and communications team, and somebody who, again, because when the crisis occurs, we're going to get pulled into it, and they're going to require our expertise. And so again, you always need to be in the lines of communications definitely have to be flowing your way. Otherwise, again, it creates all kinds of potential for havoc.
All right. And on that note, we need to wrap up. So I want to say thank you very much to Terry and to
Thank
everyone
you.
who joined us this morning.